This Film is Lit, the podcast where we finally settle the score on one simple question. Is the book really better than the movie? I'm Brian, and I have a film degree, so I watch the movie, but don't read the book.
And I'm Katie. I have an English degree, so I do things the right way and read the book before we watch the movie.
So prepare to be wowed by our expertise and charm as we dissect all of your favorite film adaptations and decide if the silver screen or the written word did it better. So turn it up, settle in, and get ready for spoilers, because this film is lit. My name is Robert Neville. I am a survivor living in New York City. I am broadcasting on all AM frequencies. I will be at the South Street Seaport every day at midday when the sun is highest in the sky. It's I Am Legend, and this film is lit. Hello and welcome back to This Film is Lit, the podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books. We're back with another patron request. This one actually requested by a patron, unlike our Godfather episode last couple weeks ago. But we had a good time with that episode nonetheless. You can check out our last prequel episode if you want to know more about that mix-up. Doesn't matter. Needless to say, we enjoyed talking about The Godfather regardless. But we're talking about I Am Legend this week, which has been adapted several times. Again, for more information on that, go check out our prequel episode. But we have a lot to get to, a lot to discuss. We don't have a Guess Who this week because there's not a lot of characters in this book or this movie. And we do not have a Lost in Adaptation. But I do have a lot of questions for Was That in the Book. But before we get to that, in case you haven't seen or read I Am Legend, or it's been a while, we have our summary section, which is Let Me Sum Up.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
Okay, so this is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, the book. Robert Neville is seemingly the last human alive after a global bacterial infection has killed most of the population and turned the rest into vampire-like creatures that roam around at night, hunting and killing. Neville does his best to conduct research in hopes of finding a cure, but struggles with lack of knowledge and resources, as well as depression. After a few years of being alone, Neville suddenly meets a woman named Ruth, who appears to be as human as he is. However, Ruth quickly reveals that she is infected, but belongs to a group of the infected that are working to rebuild society. Neville must grapple with the fact that he has unknowingly committed atrocities against these people, ultimately leading him to commit suicide to avoid being executed by them.
All right, and for the film, Robert Neville is seemingly the last human alive after a global viral outbreak from a potential cancer cure has killed most of the population and turned the rest into zombie-like creatures that roam around at night, hunting and killing. Neville, as a top-level army virologist, does his best to conduct research in hopes of finding a cure. After years of being alone, Neville suddenly meets a woman named Anna and a boy named Ethan. They are on their way to a supposed safe haven in Bethel, Vermont. Neville doubts its existence, but that evening, the Darkseers lay siege to Neville's home. After barricading themselves in his basement lab, Neville realizes his cure in his most recent test subject has worked. He gives the cure to Anna, hides her and Ethan in a coal chute, and blows himself up along with the Darkseekers, which is the name for the creatures here, giving Anna and Ethan the chance to escape with the cure to Bethel, which appears to be a real place, and it's implied that the cure gets into the hands of those who can help save the world or whatever. The end. Alternate movie ending, which we did talk about in the prequel, that this movie had an alternate ending. I'm going to kind of summarize that very quickly. All of it's very much the same until it's literally like the last 5 or 10 minutes of the film. It's very little amount of it changed. After barricading themselves in the basement lab, Neville realizes that the Darkseekers have come to rescue the test subject that he has been most recently working on. He decides to reverse his cure in her and gives her back to the Darkseeker Alpha, who, after deciding not to kill Neville, leaves with the rest of the Darkseekers. Neville then realizes that the creatures are in fact sentient, have emotions, and are able to forge relationships, and that he has become the monster in their eyes. Neville abandons his work on the cure and moves on to Bethel with Anna and Ethan as a changed man, from what I have seen. So we watched, just to really quickly get into it, we watched the we rented the DVD, but it was not the right copy of the DVD that had the actual ending. So we watched the one that's available on YouTube, which, from what I was able to read on Wikipedia, is most of the alternate ending.
It's
but
like everything except for when they actually go to Bethel.
When they go to Bethel and that sort of thing, there's more. So it kind of cuts off right after they leave him and like leave him in the basement, the Darkseekers or whatever, just let him live. But that's roughly what happens. Again, we haven't seen the entire alternate ending, but we saw like 75% of it. So that's what happens in the movie. I have a bunch of questions, so it's time to find out. Was that in the book?
Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone.
The what?
Honestly, don't you two read?
So we find out very early in the movie that the reason for this outbreak, and I believe it's because Neville is watching, he has like old tapes of newscasts basically that he like plays on his TV. And one of the ones that we see, I don't think this is in a flashback, I'm pretty sure this is him watching an old newscast, is a doctor on like some talk show talking about her new miracle cancer cure that she's working on that basically uses the measles virus, does something to it, and then it like attacks cancer cells or whatever. And basically she has now cured all cancer, which is not how that would work, but whatever. For a setup, it at least makes some amount of sense. We do modify viruses to do stuff.
It also doesn't work, so.
Right. Well, I mean, you wouldn't. The idea that it would cure cancer, like cancer is a lot of things. So, like, just as a cure for cancer, like that doesn't really mean anything. I also have problems with scaremongering about like that kind of stuff in movies of like, this is the kind of thing that leads to the point where nobody trusts medical science, like movies like that kind of. But I'm like, it's whatever. It's fine. It's a setup for your apocalypse movie. I get it. I have a little bit of a qualm with, again, it reinforces weird,
like vilifying vaccines
and science and medicine and that sort of stuff, which I have a bit of a problem with. But again, whatever. I'm able to look past it. But I want to know if that setup is the same reason for the outbreak that comes from the book, or if that's something, or if we even know in the book where this came from or what happened.
So it's not the same. We don't know exactly where it comes from in the book, but we do know a few things about this disease that turns everyone into these creatures. We know that it is bacterial, so not a virus. Although I don't know enough about medical history to know if he would have said bacterial and meant virus in the text.
Oh, you mean in the book? Like we knew about viruses in the 60s for sure, yeah.
So we know,
this is from like the 60s or 50s?
The 50s, yeah.
I'm like 99%.
So we know it's bacterial. We know that it's spread through the bloodstream. Within the universe of the story, we come to learn that there was a nuclear war. Remember, again, this was written in the 50s. And that caused dust storms as well as an increase in bugs like mosquitoes and flies, like parasitic bugs, which Neville theorizes that those elements were what helped it spread so fast, which obviously... My 2022 brain genuinely thought this was going to be about climate change at first, because the first clues that we get are the dust storms and then the increase in mosquitoes. But it is nuclear anxiety.
It's interesting.
Not climate anxiety.
It is interesting that they would choose not to go that direction. Although maybe depending on some of the other sort of through lines in this film, it's not that surprising because, this movie does have some bends towards Christianity. And it does, like I said, kind of not overtly and like terribly, but slightly vilify like medical advancements a little bit. Again, not like our good guy is also a virologist. So it's not like it's, completely, I don't know, it's complicated, but it would seem like a pretty obvious way to move the story.
Yeah, no,
in a modern setting, if you wanted to, because it also, I think it's a really interesting, it's also kind of what happened from my memory in Outbreak, which we did as a bonus episode, because we did Contagion, right, on the main episode. Or no, we did both of those as bonus episodes.
Yeah, we did both of those as bonus episodes.
But in Outbreak, the viral outbreak, part of the reason it happens, or maybe it's Contagion. No, it's Contagion. The viral outbreak, one of the reasons it happens is because they're clear-cutting
deforestation,
which, is part of...
Which forces animals into environments that they're not used to and forces them together.
And that sort of stuff. And so that is kind of what ties into the... And I think that is a realistic sort of... And especially if it's a bacterial or a viral thing that mosquitoes carry...
Yeah.
A climate where maybe mosquitoes are more, prevalent would be a good way to have that.
Those were all my thoughts exactly. I had in my notes notes because initially I was like, I saw the dust storms and mosquitoes. I was like, oh, is this going to be about climate change?
Yeah.
And then like a couple pages later, it was like the nuclear wars, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. And I was like, oh, yeah, it's the 50s.
Right.
But then I put in my notes, I was like, oh, I bet they update it because that just makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, but no.
But no.
Alas, they did not. So then we move on and we find out in the film that when we're stepping into the shoes or stepping into the story and following along with Will Smith's character, we are 3 years into the outbreak, into this apocalyptic event, and nature has sort of taken back over. He's in New York City, and it was one of my favorite things about the movie is the visual elements of seeing, nature reclaiming New York City is just a cool setting for your movie. Like, it looks really neat. And so I wanted to know if that came from the book or if that sort of city, and we talked a little bit about it in the prequel, but or if that sort of nature reclaiming the earth thing is something the movie amped up or added or whatever.
So the short story does take place over the course of a few years following the collapse of society, but we don't ever get much description of what the landscape is looking like. It's just not an element that's described. I mean, I think we could assume that there is some of that going on, but it's not described. And I agree with you. I did like that in the movie. I thought it was interesting.
And I do, because I remember in the prequel we talked about, I know it's not in New York City. I think he's in a city in the book that it's mentioned.
He's in the suburbs.
Oh, okay. But because I remember specifically they consciously moved it to New York City because they wanted it to be a very like visually identifiable place for viewers to be like, oh wow, look, Times Square is empty, and that sort of thing. And just give you that sort of,
we get the wicked billboard and
all that good stuff. We'll talk more about that later. So let's talk about Samantha. In the movie, Will Smith has a pet German Shepherd named Sam. And in the movie, we find out that this was a puppy that they had gotten right around the time that this all broke out, and he ends up getting it. His daughter, as they're like evacuating his wife and his daughter, which we'll talk more about later, she like gives him the dog, and so he has the dog and has it with him the whole movie until which events transpire that we'll talk about. And I wanted to know if he has a dog companion in the book, because that I was like, this might be a movie thing. Because they felt like it just felt too I don't know, a little on the nose, too movie-y, yeah.
He does briefly befriend a stray dog in the book, and he gains its trust by feeding it. But the dog was not long for this world, or that world, I guess, and it gets sick and dies like within a week. Okay,
so obviously they took a little bit.
There was some inspiration there,
definitely inspiration there, but they took it and expanded it, which I think makes sense. I will say, I mean, I have thoughts about this movie overall that we'll talk about later. I think this movie suffers, unlike Contagion, which is interesting, because we talked about Contagion, which I think benefits in a weird way from watching kind of, at least to some extent, benefits from watching in a post-COVID world. Like, it's fascinating in a new way. This one was just so depressing.
So bleak.
So bleak in a way that I found hard to watch, and we'll get into it a little bit more later. But, and this was one of those elements because of how dark it gets. But I do think at least the idea of giving him a canine companion throughout the course of the movie makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Then speaking of the dog, although the dog's not really important in this part, one of our opening scenes is him driving a red Mustang through the abandoned streets of New York City, chasing a herd of deer, which is a fun scene. He's like hunting deer in a Mustang. It's a little silly because like I feel like it would be easier to do what he does later, which is like see one and like you have a rifle with a scope on it, like just shoot it from it. Why are you driving around at them and like putting your gun out? Maybe he's bored.
Not?
Yeah, to be fair, he's bored. Why not? That's a fun way to hunt compared to like the normal way, I guess. But he's like chasing this herd of deer through the streets of New York City in his Mustang. And I wanted to know if that scene, I assume not, because that definitely felt like a movie thing. But I wanted to know if it came from the book.
No, he never goes hunting that we see in the book.
And thus, we don't see the scene. How this ends is he eventually gets out of the car and he's going to shoot a deer that's standing there, and a lion comes out of nowhere and grabs the deer and starts eating it, and a whole pack of lions comes out. And I love that we don't go into any detail, but it's very obvious, these were lions from the zoo that are now roaming New York City. Like, again, the city has returned to nature. I liked that. Is there anything like that with seeing like zoo animals or lions or something, like out in the world?
No, definitely not. But I also really liked that. I do want to know how they got out of their enclosures, because it seems unlikely that they could break out.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, did the creatures free them? Or, like, did the zookeepers at some point realize all was lost and just, like, be free?
I could see either of those being feasible. Like it could be one of those situations where, because what makes the most sense to me is, like, the zookeepers could have been like, we have to leave.
Yeah.
We're banned, like, or what, who knows, like, they're maybe evacuating. We see the events, and they didn't evacuate the island. They kind of did, but they basically quarantined Manhattan or whatever.
Yeah.
Which makes it a little weirder. Like, if there had been a full evacuation and everybody had left and they had been like, I guess we'll let them out because they'll just die in their cages.
Right.
I still think that's a potentially feasible answer, is that somebody was like, I'll just
open all the cages.
Yeah, it seems possible. I also like the idea, though, because we do eventually find out that the creatures are, sentient. And
they still have, like, something in there of humanity.
Yeah, that I think it is possible that they could have been like, hey, they're, game respects game. Like, they're also, like, apex predators. They were like, you guys get out there. And they have, like, an agreement. They have an accord. The lions don't hunt the dark seekers, and the dark seekers don't hunt the lions. So we get home at the end of the day, and Neville has turned his home in Manhattan into he lives right next to the big, whatever that's called. It's like the Arc de Triomphe, but the one in New York.
The one in New York.
Yeah, he lives like right across the street from it, and he gets home to his brownstone or whatever, and it's getting dark, so he slides all these big metal doors and stuff shut on all the windows and all the doors, and locks everything down at night, because that's when the creatures come out. And I wanted to know if he has fortified his home into this sweet, like, lockdown base in the book.
He has modified his home to some degree, but not to the extent that we see in the movie. In the book, basically, he's barred the doors and made the house, like, soundproof to some extent.
Okay.
But the creatures in the book aren't, like, the hulked out monsters that they are in the movie. So I don't think he would really need steel sheets. I mean,
he would need. You would still think you would want something covering the windows.
I think the windows,
to some extent, you would board it up.
Yeah,
you would want something covering the windows because they could get through pretty easily. But yeah, they're not quite the intimidating creatures that they are.
Not quite.
In the film. So then, as he goes to sleep that evening, I think it's while he's washing the dog, we get a flashback, and this is the first one of the film, and we will get several throughout. And I thought this works pretty well. We get flashback to the events of when everything went to shit, when everything went bad, and the evacuation, and him trying to get his family out, and all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to know if we get any of that backstory in the book, or if this is wholly added for the movie, or if maybe the book starts there, you know what I mean? And then we jump forward, and the movie decided to do it as flashback, or how is that handled compared to the film?
The book is structured very similarly. This is probably the thing that is, on the whole, most similar.
Okay.
But it is structured very similarly. We have flashbacks to the before times, kind of slowly doled out, so that we come to understand how he ended up in this situation and what's going on.
Yeah, I think it works really well in the movie because it does happen in sort of, it's either when he's sleeping, or like he kind of has like PTSD style, like sort of flashbacks. And I think doling it out slowly, figuring out, like, I like the sort of piecemeal thing of like, well, how does he have the dog? Because, like, it seems like they're taking the dog, but we know he has, maybe it's a different dog. We don't, and like sort of the puzzle pieces slowly clicking into place and finding out that backstory, I think works really well in the movie. I liked that. It's kind of figuring out that mystery, and so it's kind of cool to know that part comes from the book. So, speaking of, I mentioned earlier in the sum up section that he has a basement lab. Like we've said, he's working on a cure. Because in the movie, he's a army virologist and like one of their lead virologists or whatever. He's Dustin Hoffman from Outbreak. And I wanted to know does he have a sweet lab in his basement in the book? And also because you mentioned that in your summation that he was lacking, and maybe you have this in a different section.
I do have this in a different section.
Okay, well then we'll get to it in a later section then. Never mind, we'll get to that later. Does he have a lab in his basement?
He does not have a sweet lab in his basement, but he does have a science room where he does basic research. He calls it his science room. He has a microscope.
Gotcha.
There's a whole section of the book where he's getting a microscope.
Okay.
He gets a bad one at first, and then he's like, this microscope is shit. And he goes and gets a different one.
I'm really interested to talk about this later, this difference in character, because I think that's really fascinating. And we'll get there. So we kind of see him going through his daily routine, and he's going out looking for supplies, going hunting, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things he does is he stops by his local movie store and walks in, and he's like watching every single movie in the store, which why not?
He's like working his way through alphabetically.
Yeah, he's on G at this point in the film, or halfway through G, I think he says. But he has set up all these mannequins in the movie store that he talks to give himself some semblance of, normalcy. But it's also our first clue that he is not.
He's suffering.
He's suffering,
yeah.
and he's mentally declining as. Obviously, through this isolation and the horrible events that he's gone through, he's not completely sound of mind, which makes total sense in this situation. But I want to know if specifically the mannequins and talking to the mannequins and all that came from the book.
No, there's nothing about that. Nothing like that in the book. A very interesting scene, like that first scene where he's talking to the mannequins. It also scared the crap out of me. That when he first like pulls up and they're like standing outside, I was like, what's that?
Yeah. I like that. I think it's interesting. Again, I like especially because to this point, we haven't gotten the hint that he isn't handling, like that he's not doing well. Like he seems fine, he's out hunting, he's eating, he's talking to the dog, but that's like, everybody talks to their dog, like it's whatever.
Yeah.
And then to get to this point where we see that he has these mannequins set up and he's interacting with them in a way that it's very emotionally evocative, because it very quickly makes you sympathize with the position that he's in and feel bad for him. But also it's like really understand. I thought that was a fun addition, or not, maybe not fun's not the right word, but I thought that was a good addition for the story they were telling. So he gets to a point where there's a whole bunch of stuff where Sam runs into a building and he finds a bunch of the Dark Seekers in there. And then he ends up deciding to trap one. And we'll find out eventually that he's done this a lot of times, it would seem. Hundreds of times or something. We don't know that at this point. We're like, maybe this is the first time he's done this. But no, he's done it a bunch of times. But he has like he sets up like a Wile E. Coyote trap of like a cable and a foot loop and a car on a bridge that is gonna it's a whole deal, and a blanket so that the sun doesn't kill the monster or the Dark Seeker, and he lures it out with some of his blood and he's able to trap the thing. And I wanted to know if that sweet Wile E. Coyote trap contraption came from the book.
No, it didn't. The creatures in the book sleep during the day.
Well, they do in the movie
like
too.
Vampires. They're not like sleeping. They are sleeping, but they're like dead. They're vampires.
Okay.
So all he doesn't have to trap one. All he has to do is like go get one out of its bed.
Oh, so they don't. Not only they're like out.
Yes.
Out. Like they're like full hibernation. Like,
yeah.
Okay. Because I mean, in the movie, they're also like
right. They stay out of the sun.
Well, but and they are seemingly like doing some sort of weird sleep hibernation thing. Like they're all standing in a circle, like breathing weird. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
they're doing some sort of like kind of hibernation
thing.
A
little different in the book because like he can like go get one and they don't wake up.
Right. Yeah. But in the film, they're kind of like hibernating. But if you make enough noise they will wake up and come after you. So, okay, that's an interesting difference. At this point, when he traps that one, another one runs out and like screams at him. And I don't remember the exact context of this, but he's making notes and he says something along the lines, and I don't remember exactly why he says this because it is funny upon watching it. To me, it seemed the opposite.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the interaction that he saw after he trapped that one and another one came out and like yelled at him, Oh, it's because it went out into the sun. And it went into the sun a little bit and gets burned.
Yeah.
And he interprets that as like an abandonment of its
like survival
instincts,
Yeah.
and to where it's like it doesn't, it can't reason at all anymore. It's just like this, mindless thing, as opposed to the very obvious interpretation. Again, we don't know what all he's been through. It's we're coming at it from this is our really like our first interaction with
The
these
very
creatures.
obvious interpretation of.
Hey, what are you doing?
Took my
you
friend.
jerk, you took one of us. Yeah, like, which is very obvious watching the film that's what's going on. But we haven't been through his deal, so we don't know exactly what all he's seen. But yeah, his interpretation is, it's completely mine. It's like, okay, sure, fine. I don't know how well that works, but he says in his notes, social de-evolution complete. Like they don't have, like they're completely mindless or whatever. And does he come to that same conclusion in the book that they are they at this point they completely lack any sort of like human traits or sentience or anything like that?
Okay, so this was an element in the book that I did not think the story did a particularly good job of making clear. So if anyone would like to explain this to me like I'm 5, I'm down for that.
Okay.
So he does think of the creatures, as being like completely taken over by the bacteria. But whether or not that's true is debatable at a point. He eventually comes to understand that there are basically 2 types of these creatures. There are the ones that are like dead undead.
Okay.
And then there are other ones that are like technically still alive, but they're infected. But then there's possibly a 3rd type later on. But I don't think that the book does a good job of explaining this aspect of the story, like I said. But I guess to answer your question, he does not think of them as human.
Okay.
So
he does come to the same kind of conclusion before eventually finding out, which the same thing happens in this movie at the end, or at least in the alternate ending, which we'll get to that later. But in the alternate ending of this movie, he does eventually realize, they're not mindless monsters. Like it is, that does come in the book, that he does at least believe that at some point in the book before realizing otherwise. I do think, based on what you said there, without having read it, obviously, that the movie's choice to maybe just make all of the creatures the same level of conscious
that was probably
or sentient
a good
makes
choice.
sense.
Yeah.
Like it seems a little strange to have like these different. I mean, it can work, I think, potentially in a story, because there are different levels of like the infection or whatever. You could do that, but I think for the point of the story, from what I can gather based on the alternate ending, having them all just be the same level of like sentient makes the most sense for like kind of the overall point.
Yeah.
Versus having some of them actually be like mindless creatures and others not. It seems kind of weird and complicated. But again, didn't read the book. I thought this was a little fun moment. Wanted to know if it came from the book. Felt like a movie thing. He's in some museum. I'm sure somebody from New York knows what museum that is. I've never been to New York, so I don't know. But he's fishing in a koi pond in some museum. And I wanted to know if that happened in the book.
Not from the book, but I do think that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Especially because koi will get really big if you just leave them.
Yeah. Although, they have to be fed.
Well,
I guess maybe he's feeding them.
Yeah,
I don't.
Maybe.
Because, I was just wondering like where they're getting food from. Maybe the creatures are feeding them.
Perhaps.
Kind of like the letting out they're going around feeding all the animals.
We don't know what they do at night. We never see them at night.
True, we don't know.
Maybe they're just running around caring for all the animals of the city.
Yeah, they could be. I actually think that would be really interesting. That would be a fun twist. I think that would add to the ultimate ending that we get. So eventually, he's out on another mission, and he sees one of his dummies, or one of the mannequins from the movie store, out at Grand Central Station. He's like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like freaking out about it. And he walks over to investigate. And as he does so, he steps into a trap and gets caught in the exact same way that he trapped the creature earlier. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted, because it's our first indication, other than the creature yelling, that like, oh, these things are more intelligent than we have been led to believe. And I wanted to know if that happened in the book.
It does not.
Okay. And after he is trapped, he passes out and he's hanging there, and it's getting dark. He comes to, and as he comes to, the creature releases these infected dogs, which they talk about in the film a couple times. The dogs are immune to the airborne version of this virus, but are not immune to like the whatever, like the
if you get bitten or
scratched or fluid version, basically contact version. They're not immune to that. So these dogs are like the infected version, and the alpha creature thing that we see sends them out after Will Smith and Sam. I wanted to know if the creatures in the book have infected dogs that they as companions, because that was interesting.
They do not. The book does mention that dogs are susceptible to the bacteria, but we never interact with any like infected dogs.
And the dog that in the book that you mentioned that he finds but gets sick and dies, does it get sick from this disease or just...
Maybe.
Okay.
It's never like 100% clear. It doesn't like turn into a vampire creature. It just dies.
Okay.
So like it could have been, but maybe not.
Right. So they have to fight off these dogs. Sam helps fight them off, but in the process gets bitten and several times and is now infected. And confession, I skipped this part of the movie for Katie. I knew that we would just. I
was already on the verge of tears.
Yes,
leading
because
up
even
to
the
that
parts
scene.
that we see that I skipped after he picks up Sam off the street and the dog is like very clearly mortally wounded. That was where I skipped forward because I saw this movie in theaters and that scene scarred me. And I don't have the same attachment to German Shepherds that you have. So I was like, we're just going to skip this scene because it's truly one of the most traumatizing, awful scenes I've seen in a movie.
But I know this scene lives in infamy,
yes.
and I care to never watch it.
Yeah. So we skipped that. But point being, the dog gets infected. He treats it a little bit, but it does turn and he kills the dog. And a truly just heartbreaking, a very effective filmmaking, but just some of the like most heart-wrenching, awful, 5 minutes of movie. Lots of bad things happen in lots of movies. I'm not going to go over here and say that this is worse than stuff that happens in like a bunch of other movies, but it is a very traumatic scene. So my point being, you kind of answered this already. The dog doesn't seem to be infected by...
Well, it doesn't turn into a creature.
Doesn't turn into a creature. Because it does in the movie, or at least kind of.
Like starts to.
It starts to. Okay. But anyways, sorry if you watched this movie and didn't know about that. I think I mentioned it several times in the lead up to this episode.
We talked about it in the prequel.
You would have to know where it was, I guess. I knew where it was. I mean, it's pretty obvious, I guess, but you wouldn't know where to skip. I knew where to skip because I had seen this movie before, but
my childhood dog was a German Shepherd.
Yeah.
In case that wasn't clear.
Yeah.
I'll share a picture on our social media.
Yeah, and like I said, when I saw this movie when it came out, like senior year of high school or whatever, I remember everybody in the theater just being like, "Oh my god,
yeah,
like fuck this!" Like it's real bad. And again, it is effective filmmaking. I think you can do things like that in your movie. I just felt while we were watching it that it wasn't necessary for you to view that at that time. After Sam dies, he buries Sam out in like a cornfield or something, or maybe Central Park. I don't know. He's digging a hole. He buries Sam somewhere. And then he goes to the movie store and he promised Sam that he would say hi to this girl mannequin that he's, had a thing for or whatever. And he's standing there in the movie store. And now I assume this doesn't happen, but I'm going to ask if anything like this happens. Because there's this moment where he's standing there and he says hello to her and he's trying to talk to her. And then obviously it's a mannequin, doesn't say anything. And this is like the day after, he had to kill his dog. And he keeps saying like, please say hello to me in the most pitiful. It's heartbreaking and terrible and super sad. He keeps saying, please say hello to me. And obviously it's a mannequin, doesn't say anything. Is anything like that happen in the book? Because fuck this movie. For that.
No, nothing like that happens in the book. But I agree. A tough scene.
It's a tough scene. Yeah, that 10 minutes of this movie is real rough. And the thing that's annoying is that it doesn't really ever get better.
Yeah.
Although the alternate ending is better. It's so we'll talk about it, but it's so frustrating to me. This movie with the alternate ending could have been, I think, okay. That it ends on a slightly happier note.
I have a lot of thoughts about the ending.
And like a slightly happier note that like says something, whereas we'll get there. He goes out that night to just murder a bunch of the Dark Seekers because and basically to just, he's like, I don't care. He's going to kill himself. He's not like explicitly killing himself, kind of, but he basically is. Mm-hmm. But he's just like running over all these Dark Seekers, and his car flips over and he's about to get eaten. And then a woman shows up with a road flare and saves him. And this is Anna, who I mentioned. And I wanted to know if he is saved by a random Christian woman. She makes very explicit several times that she's Christian throughout the course of the film. We see a cross hanging from the mirror, and they talk about God a lot at one point, and her faith and whatnot. And I wanted to know if that happens.
He does eventually run into a woman. No kid. Mm-hmm. Her name is Ruth. She does wear a cross necklace.
Okay.
So she could be a Christian, but she is not what she seems. She ends up being one of the alive but infected creatures, and she lives with this group of similar beings, and she has been sent there to spy on him and find out more about him and what he's doing. And the group that she's in has developed a pill that allows them to be in the sun for short amounts of time. And they're going to rebuild society.
That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. I actually...
And she does wear a cross, so she could be a Christian, right. Or it could be like a red herring to lure him into a false sense of security, because crosses do work on these creatures.
Oh, interesting. Okay, but so apparently the pill that works on the sun also works on the crosses.
Perhaps.
Because we did mention in the and we didn't talk. I don't know if we have a note about it, or maybe you do later. Like garlic also works on these creatures, I believe, in the book.
Yeah.
And so they are kind of traditionally way more vamp. The movie, they're much more. That's why I did that. What I did in the Let Me Sum Up, where I basically copied yours and swapped out words.
Yeah.
That felt apt to swap, whereas you described them as vampires, I described them as zombies, because in the movie, to me, they feel much more like zombies, to some extent.
Yeah, they're like roided out.
Yeah, like
zombies.
rage zombies, like your 28 Days Later, which I think this movie, we talked about in the prequel that their decision, like the visual aspects of the New York City and the abandoned streets and stuff, they were pulling some inspiration from like 28 Days Later, and in that film. In that series, the zombies they're infected by a rage virus from my memory, and so they're super fast, they run around, they're strong, and they're like zombies, but they're
not like the slow.
They're not like the slow shuffling, they're rage zombies. Anyways, so yeah, I thought that was an interesting difference between the movie and the book, is having them be more zombie-like in the movie. Which again, also, I guess this isn't I don't think Walking Dead had happened. No, the comics maybe, but the show was not out yet, I don't think. So this wasn't in the big craze of zombies, but it was like before the big craze of zombies. In the flashbacks, we see what happened to his family. He ends up getting them onto a helicopter, and then as they're flying away, another helicopter, like a news helicopter or something, a bunch of people are jumping on it trying to escape, and it ends up careening and crashing into their helicopter, killing his wife and his daughter. And I wanted to know if that's the same thing, if he's standing there and sees his family die in the book.
That is not what happens in the book. So he does have a wife and daughter. Mm-hmm. His daughter dies before his wife does. And at that point in trying to contain the virus, they're burning all of the bodies of the infected.
Yeah.
So they basically have and it's I think still burning. When we join him in the story, there's a giant fire, somewhere on the outskirts of where he lives, where you're supposed to go dump infected bodies. And so he has to go dump his daughter's body in the fire, and that's like super traumatizing to him. So then when his wife dies, he's like, I can't throw her in the fire. I can't do it. So he buries her even though it's illegal. And then she ends up coming back to the house.
Ooh.
And he has to like kill her again.
Yeah, they missed an opportunity there. That would.
Yeah, I think
I say missed an opportunity. This movie's already depressing enough. I don't know if we needed that necessarily.
I think that the helicopter scene works for the movie, but I did find the book's version of events more interesting.
Yeah, it definitely could be a little more interesting. I thought the flashbacks in the movie worked pretty well. Like overall, I thought they were pretty. That was one of the more effective parts of the film. A lot of the film's effective. I don't want to say the film's not effective. The film's effective. Whether or not I enjoy it is a different thing. But I think it was fairly effective, and I thought the flashback stuff was particularly well done. So he wakes up after he's having that nightmare. He got stabbed in the leg when he got caught by the monsters, and so he's been bleeding a lot. And he like passes out. Anna ends up stitching up his leg. He comes to the next morning after having the dream about when his family died. And Anna and Ethan are like making breakfast, and he walks in and they start eating breakfast, and he's a manifestation of his inability to cope with the fact that there are just randomly now humans in his life that he has not seen in years or whatever. He's been alone forever. He kind of, that explodes in this moment of him not being able to like deal with this by him like throwing his breakfast against the wall and being like, I was saving that bacon. Because that's how this moment of like, again, this emotional outburst of like just not being able to do. He immense trauma of losing the dog, and all this sort of stuff, and then being injured, and then having a dream about his family dying, and he's been alone for all this time. That all bubbles forth, and it bursts forth in him sort of ranting about how she cooked this bacon that he was saving, which I thought was a good way to do that. I thought that was a really effective scene, and I wanted to know if that came from the book.
It doesn't.
Okay.
No.
That was a long way to ask that question, and just get a no. That's fair. So then him and Anna get into a big, long argument about religion. She's very religious, and she's all about, like, God has a plan. We're, blah, 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 this, that, and the other. And she still has faith, and he's like, no, God's dead, blah, blah, blah. He's very nihilist pilled at this point, although not really, because he's still trying to find a cure. He's very he's very much not on Team God's side at this point. He's like, do you see what happened out here? Did you see what all went down?
Who could blame him?
Yeah, no, I'm not not blaming him. I'm just saying. But one of the lines, and this is a line I remembered from the movie very specifically, is, she's talking about how it's all part of like God's plan or whatever, and he says, God didn't do this, Anna, we did. And it's like a powerful moment. I want to know if that line came from the book, like if he ever yells anything like that at anybody dramatically.
No, he does not. There's a very little like religious aspect to this book. He does at one point pray for the dog when it's sick. He's like, I didn't even know why I was doing it, but I prayed for the dog.
Yeah.
But that doesn't ever go anywhere. Like, it doesn't develop into anything. Yeah. The only other kind of religious element is the crosses. And he's trying to reason out, and for a while, why crosses seem to work on these vampires, because he's like, that doesn't make any sense.
It's actually really interesting that the book would address that, and be like, let him try to figure that out.
So what we come to find out is he theorizes, because like as society was collapsing, there was this uptick in like cults.
Okay.
And like people like trying to drag people in, like, oh, you'll be saved.
Yeah.
Come join our cult.
That if Walking Dead has anything to say about that, that's a very accurate. If Walking Dead is in a trusted authority on zombie apocalypses, there will be cults.
So what he theorizes is that it's like a leftover like trauma imprint. their bodies retain, basically, of like this fear of like, oh, I'm damned now,
Right.
essentially. And we do also find out, because he's kind of musing about it at one point, and he's like, would crosses work on vampires that were not Christian? And I was like, valid question.
Very valid question.
Would they? And we come to find out that one of his neighbors was Jewish, and he showed him the Torah, and it worked similarly.
That's a fun. That would have been a weird scene. That
would have been a really weird
scene, but
like it's interesting.
It's interesting,
at least.
Yeah. It is interesting. It is interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, they all come to attack. They were able to follow Anna and Ethan back to his house, is what the movie explains. And so they all come to lay siege to the house. And as they're all running up, he sees them all coming, and he has a bunch of lights outside that he's turning on, and that kind of stalls a few of them, but not enough. And then he hits a button and just blows up like everything outside. I was like, wait, what? Okay, the movie decided it needed explosions, and my guess is that this is very much a movie edition. But I wanted to know if he has giant booby trap bombs everywhere outside of his house in the book.
That is very much of a movie edition. His attempts to fortify or do protective measures around his home basically consist of stringing garlic around it.
Okay.
And he does try digging like a small moat, basically, because there's the old folklore that like vampires can't cross running water.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. No giant explosions.
No giant explosions.
After that, they're now in the house, and he's fighting them. There's a big fight. He's like fist fighting monsters, and he's got a machine gun. He's shooting everywhere, and everything's blowing up. And I want to know if any of that big fight scene from the end happens in the book, because to me, it all again felt very much like a movie edition.
So at the end of the story, some of the vampires who are from the same group as the woman that he met do break into his house and like take him away, but it's not nearly as action-y as the movie is. No explosions, no all-out destruction.
Yeah, okay. That's kind of what I figured, is that it definitely wasn't the action sequence that we get in the film. So they escape into the basement, and this is one of those things that makes a lot more sense in the alternate version from what I read on Wikipedia than it does in the So just to clarify, the alternate ending, which we're gonna get to here in just a second, is the original ending. Like the alternate ending for this film is actually what they originally had, and then test audiences didn't like it for whatever reason, because they're dumb, they're stupid, and so they redid the whole ending. And in the redone ending, they're trying to break. They're like in this. He has like this glass like enclosure that he keeps the test subjects in his basement while he's like running tests on them and stuff. And they lock themselves in there, and all the dark seekers are in the basement trying to get to them in this glass enclosure. And one of them keeps throwing the alpha one keeps like throwing itself against the glass, and eventually the glass breaks into the shape of like a butterfly, and literally Will Smith just like has a memory of his daughter saying, "Oh, the butterfly."
Yeah.
And then turns and sees a butterfly on Anna's neck.
Yeah, she has like a little tattoo.
A little tattoo of a butterfly on Anna's neck, and somehow that triggers something in him, and he's like, "I'm listening now." And then that makes him realize that the cure is in that his cure worked. And it makes very little sense, in my opinion. I would love for somebody to try to explain how we'll talk about the alternate ending, which also doesn't make a ton of sense, but makes more sense. We'll get there in a second. And he realizes, oh, the cure, Anna should take the cure because whatever. And he pulls the cure out of the blood from the test subject he had. It has the cure. He gives it to Anna, shoves them in the thing. Is anything with the butterfly, we'll get to that second part, but is anything with the butterfly and the tattoo, is any of that come from the book?
No, none of that is from the book. That part did make me feel like the studio wanted M. Night Shyamalan for this.
Yeah.
That felt like it's all connected.
Right. It's
moment.
weird. Yeah, it does. So to clarify, because I don't have a note about it here later, in the alternate version, the original ending of the film, the same thing happens, but the butterfly tattoo is on the neck of the test subject. And he sees that, and something in that triggers the fact he then realizes they're here for her.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't really make sense because it's not like the guy drew a butterfly on the glass.
Right.
He was slamming his body against it, and the resulting shape kind of looked like a butterfly. But at least that kind of makes sense that it made him
tracks a little
stop
bit.
and think about, like, he was like, oh, and then he sees the butterfly on her neck, and he's like, oh, and then and that's what leads him to give the test subject back to them. But in the movie, it's like, well, how does this doesn't connect at all? But they had to keep it because they'd already, it's a mess. Anyways, so none of the butterfly stuff comes from the book. It does feel a little M. Night.
Yeah.
Yeah, like,
it's a little,
like swing
it's
away.
Little signs,
Swing away, yeah, kind of deal. Yeah, absolutely. And then in the film, in the ending, the theatrical ending, he throws Anna and Ethan in a coal chute so they can escape with the cure, and then he grabs a grenade, and the world's largest grenade. Like, that is not how grenades blow. Again, also, it's a thing very clearly shot, unless I completely missed it, very clearly this was all done very late in the process because we never saw a grenade. Like, it's just all of a sudden he opens a drawer and there's a grenade there. And also this grenade creates an explosion that blows up the entire basement, which grenades can be, depending on the type of grenade, it can have a pretty large, but like, that is not the explosion I'm pretty sure of even a high explosive grenade I don't think would blow up an entire, whatever. Doesn't matter. He pulls the pin on a grenade, runs into all the monsters, and blows them all up. If I was this director, I'd be losing my mind. Like, the writer and director, if the studio came back to me and was like, okay, so your ending, boo, sucks. Completely change it to something that makes no sense. I would never make another movie again in my life. Like, I get mad, and when clients come back and they're like, can you change this one shot? I'm like, no, it's perfect as it is. That's not true. Sometimes they have good ideas, but the idea of somebody coming to me and being like, completely change the ending of your movie to an entirely different thing that makes literally no sense, I would never work again. I would be like, I'm done. I quit forever. Anyways, does he blow himself up and kill all the creatures?
He does commit suicide at the end of the book.
Okay, so Jesus, all right. I wasn't expecting that, honestly.
But it's by pills. It's not by hand grenade.
And he doesn't blow up all the creatures. No. Yeah. Okay. So the alternate ending, as I mentioned, I was guessing this might be closer to the book. He opens the door, like I said, he realizes the butterfly that triggers something. He realizes that, oh my God, they are sentient. They're here for her. And he gives her back to them, and they kind of yell at him a bit, but then they leave. And like I said earlier, it's not in the one on YouTube, but they the next day they leave together and go to Bethel, and he's able to move on with his life. He has now closed this chapter. He is not legend anymore. Is that closer to the book? Because I do think the idea that becomes very clear that he's in this alternate ending, that he's the monster, because like after he gives it back to them and they're like yelling at him and stuff, or after he gives back the one he kidnapped and they're like yelling at him and stuff, we see the shot of the bulletin board with like hundreds of pictures of all the test subjects he's killed, kidnapped and killed trying to cure them. And that's a fun Twilight Zone episode. Like, that's what this feels like. That's a fun Twilight Zone episode twist of like, oh shit, they're like they're also they're also sentient creatures. Yes, they might not be human anymore, quote unquote human anymore, but and he's the one hunting them. Like, that's a fun twist. And so that felt to me like it had to be closer to what the book does. Is that closer to what the book does?
Yes. So none of that ending is from the book, except for the idea that he's become a monster to them.
Okay.
That's why he's a legend.
Yes.
He has essentially become the boogeyman to a new race of people.
I think I had heard that. I knew that sort of
Yeah.
culturally. I had absorbed that at some point, so I knew that. And so this ending, that the alternate ending worked for me in that way. But
Now, I actually think that the movie does a better job at setting up the creatures as sentient than the book does. In the book, all we see of the creatures is that they come out at night and they like flock around his house, but they seem much more like animals or like they're on like an autopilot of sorts and are like being operated by this bacteria.
yeah.
There's never any indication that they've retained their humanity until Ruth shows up and just seems completely normal.
Yeah.
So I didn't think that the book did a great job with that. In the movie, like we talked about, when he captures the creature, we see that the other creature is upset about it.
Yeah.
We see that they can reason and organize. They set a trap for him. They know what to bait it with.
Yeah.
They obviously have social structure. They're maintaining their symbiotic relationship with dogs. The creatures in the movie are somehow both more and less human than
Yeah.
they are in the book.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side of that, I think that the book might do a better job of setting up Neville as a boogeyman. Because not only does he grab these creatures and do like amateur science experiments on them, he also just like trolls around through houses during the day, staking them while they sleep in their beds.
Yeah.
Like literally on a one-man mission to rid his town of vampires.
I think that would have been interesting. Like they could have done that.
Yeah.
And I think it also, and maybe you have this in another segment, but what I talked about earlier, where with him being a virologist and versus not in the book, since he doesn't know what he's doing in the book and he's not actually making any he's just like
he's just like doing
like you said,
whatever
amateur science.
he thinks.
Yeah. I think that makes it that part of the twist of, like you said, of him being set up as the boogeyman, as this monster, make more sense than the movie does. But it is interesting that the movie's version of the monsters works better.
But it's also
twist.
in the book, it also reflects the vampire-like natures of the creatures. Because in folklore, a vampire is a creature that is an othered human that creeps out at night and kills you in your bed while you're asleep.
Yeah.
So Robert Neville becomes the legend that he seeks to destroy.
Yeah.
In this kind of flipped world, he is a vampire.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really fascinating. I really do think that the movie was close with the original ending.
Much closer.
It was
yeah.
if they had done the original ending, if they had just tweaked a few things, if maybe he wasn't a virologist or even if he was, but we just saw him going around killing them willy-nilly. Because the only time we see that is after like they kill his dog and like, you know, he's like
when he's
lost
like
it
traumatized.
completely. Yeah.
And...
Like if from the beginning we had seen him, I think that would have been really fascinating too, because we wouldn't question it. Like they're like that's the fun rug pull, is that we would be like, oh yeah, like even if he is,
even like reading the book, you don't question it at all, and that's because it is something very common to see in zombie media. You see a zombie, you kill it.
Yeah, I think that would have been really fascinating if they would have done the movie almost exactly the same, but just give more of those elements of him doing things that become clear later. Oh, that he's been the monster the whole time. We just didn't realize because we didn't have the frame of reference.
Yeah.
And becomes a very fascinating exploration of like empathy and that sort of thing. And I do agree that the movie fails at that, even with the original ending. I don't know if it would be completely effective.
I agree.
But it's close, like the original ending, the alternate ending is much closer to that.
Yes.
And the fucking theatrical ending is a nightmare
It's
some
nightmare. It's a
coked
nightmare.
up studio exec thought up in 10 minutes. 100%. Anyways. Okay. That was all the questions I had. It's time now to find out what Katie thought was better in the book.
You like to read?
Oh, yes. I love to read.
What do you like to read?
Everything.
So we've talked a little bit about this.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is better in the book per se, because having an actual scientist doing real scientific work makes so much sense for this story,
Yeah.
especially as a high-stakes sci-fi horror film.
It also gives him a reason to not leave with his family.
Yes.
With the way they
Yeah.
do the family story, like he's staying to try to fix it.
To try to fix it.
I think it's also, the movie makes it, and I don't know if you're going to get into this, but it's also becomes a sort of meta narrative about work consuming a person and just being like he's just lost. He's lost himself to this commitment to fix, quote unquote. He keeps saying, "I can fix this. I can fix this." And so I
buddy,
think
you can't.
you can't. And I like the idea if there was nothing to fix necessarily. Like, also, I think that then makes it better if the disease itself wasn't human. Like if we didn't know where it came from, if it was just like in the book, like if the source of this disease or whatever wasn't something that like we had done.
I mean, it is implied in the book that it might be because of the nuclear wars,
Right.
But
Yeah, I guess, okay. But I guess my point is that if it wasn't so clearly like, oh, we created this thing and that, like this disease and that is what created all these.
Yeah, it is much more black and white in the movie.
I think if it hadn't been that, if it had been more vague where it came from, him raging against it, his desire to fix it becomes even more futile because it's not something we did. Like,
we can't reverse it. It's just a thing that happened.
And so he becomes, Don Quixote. He's tilting at these wind. I don't know. I think that could have been. I think it still works. Anyways.
Anyway, I did find it really interesting in the book that he's basically just breaking into the local library and trying to like educate himself as much as he can and doing like these random science experiments and like reasoning and trying to figure it out. And now to be fair, I don't think the book ever says what his job was, aside from a small mention that he was in the army at one point, which, I mean, this is post-war, so pretty much everybody was. But men anyway.
Yeah.
But I guess he could be a scientist of some sort, but it doesn't seem like it necessarily.
He doesn't seem the same. He's definitely not the same level of like head
he's
virologist
not
for
a
the
top
army.
virologist.
This isn't like his wheelhouse necessarily. Yeah.
You kind of got the vibe that maybe he could be like a middle school science teacher.
Yeah.
Like he knows some stuff.
He could have been like a medic or something, like maybe he was a medic and had some, some background in biology or something like that. Like he went to med school or something, but wasn't like super specialized in virology
or bacteriology.
In the case of the
whatever
book.
It's called.
The case of the book, I don't know what it'd be called. Whatever. But yeah, I think there are merits to both versions of that character. I think there are, like you said, it's hard to know where to put it because I think the version of him in the movie is interesting where he is a virologist. Because I think you can still do most of thematically what you want to do with him being a virologist. But I also think there's something interesting about watching this guy try to fix things that is just way out of his depth. And like, I'm gonna cure a global pandemic. I'm just a dude.
It is kind of like if you were the last guy left on Earth and you were just like, I guess I'll try. I've got nothing but time.
A bunch of biology textbooks in the local high school. Just go start reading, I guess. I don't know.
Don't take anything from a school in America. They're all outdated.
That's true.
I thought
also way beyond the pay grade of high school to be like way beyond the education level of high school to be trying to cure diseases.
You would probably be better served to raid the university library than our local public library.
Yes, I think that would be the safer bet.
I thought the movie should have kept some of the vampire aspects of this story. We get like the garlic, the crosses, the stakes. We get all of it. And I thought him trying to figure out how all of these folklore elements make sense from a scientific perspective is an interesting opinion or an interesting premise.
Yeah.
There was a line that I liked from the book when he's like, because at one point he's like reading Dracula, trying to like figure out if there's any like clues in this text about vampires. And he's like, and before science had caught up with legend, the legend had swallowed science and everything, which I thought was an interesting
That's a good line. I do think that I think I can understand why they would drop that because it does feel like something that would require so much explanation that
Yeah.
people would just find it silly. Like
yeah.
people would be hard pressed. It would be a gimme that you would have to ask from the audience. That would just I don't know if audiences would be able to be like, okay, sure, I guess they're like. I think reading that and discussing it, and especially in the time period when the book was written, it maybe works better. But I don't know. I can see why that would be if I was adapting this, that would be one of the first things where I was like, let's not deal with. That would be too hard to do. I'm not saying you couldn't do it. I'm just saying I can.
With the right creative team, and if you gave it the right tone, I think you could do this.
Again, I'm not saying you couldn't. I just totally understand the idea of being like, let's get that out of here. That's too hard to figure out.
So Robert Neville drinks a lot during this book.
I get it.
Which, like, the movie dropping, like, that's not upsetting to me.
Right.
But it was kind of funny to read because he's constantly either throwing or dropping his whiskey glasses. Like, this novella is only around 160 pages, and I lost track of how many drinking glasses this guy shattered over the course of it. Like, every other page, he's shattering a whiskey glass. I'm like, he's apparently not worried about running out of glassware.
No, well, why would he? You can just go anywhere and get it. There is a moment in the movie where when he goes into somebody's apartment or house or whatever, I'm pretty sure he picks up a bottle of booze and sticks it in his bag.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
We don't ever see him drink it or like whatever comes back, but I'm pretty sure he like grabs a bottle and sticks it in like his rucksack or whatever.
Yeah.
So
there's also a moment in the book, it's pretty early on, where he's like pouring himself a drink, and it's like he had given up measuring his liquor long ago, and I was like, oof, that's a mood. So one of his neighbors in this is a creature.
Just the Jewish guy?
Yes, it is the Jewish guy. He's like a recurring character, comes outside of his house every night and yells at him to come out. It's like this kind of autopilot thing, I guess, because he always yells the same thing.
Yeah.
And we see the neighbor in a few of the flashbacks too. But I thought that was an interesting element. This movie, the story plays kind of with like the suburbia element that we don't get in the movie.
Yeah, no. That would be interesting though.
Yeah. And I do think there's something to be said for the book taking place in the suburbs. At least looking at it from my perspective in 2022, because I feel like overgrown city is a pretty like common setting at this point.
Yeah.
But the suburbs I felt like was a little bit interesting. Like to me, it felt a little fresh.
Yeah.
Looking at it now.
I guess, yeah. It is interesting. It definitely makes sense at the time in the 50s because, you know, that's when back from the war, that's when suburban America happened, was the 50s. So it is, it definitely makes sense. It's definitely timely at the time it was written.
There's a moment in the book where he's out during the day and it's overcast, so he can't like keep an eye on where the sun is in the sky. And he has this moment of horror that his watch has stopped. And he doesn't know what time it is, so he doesn't know how close it is to sunset. And I really was expecting the movie to do that.
Yeah, they don't do that. They do the moment when he gets knocked out, when he gets trapped,
when he wakes up and the sun is
up,
setting.
the sun's setting and his alarm goes off.
Yeah.
I think, from my memory, on his watch. And so I think that's kind of a similar idea of like, oh crap, it's sunset already.
After he finds the dog. And he's decided that he's going to try to like befriend this dog and have it as a companion. There's this description of him getting stuff for the dog, and it stood out to me because it's so absurdly normal in the middle of this text. It's like he went down to the market and got several cans of dog food and some flea shampoo and I loved it. I was like, this is such a weird, like normal little bubble in the middle of this book.
Yeah.
Another weird moment that I loved when he sees Ruth in the book.
The seemingly
woman.
Human
Yes,
at first.
The seemingly completely normal human woman. He sees her like across a field. and he just screams hi at her.
Yeah. I mean, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are your social skills at that point?
None.
They're nothing. I did not particularly enjoy that Will Smith did Shrek from memory in this movie.
Really? I liked it.
I thought it was
it.
kind of cringy.
I thought it was fun. I enjoyed it.
Okay, well,
He actually,
we'll agree
I don't
to
know if I
disagree.
remember. I don't remember if I said that in the prequel, but I remember reading when I was doing research that he called up like the execs from who did DreamWorks. DreamWorks. He called up the execs and was like, we want to use, Will Smith called whoever he needed to talk to and was like, we want to use Shrek in our movie. We're making a movie. We want to use Shrek in it. Please let us use Shrek. And they were like, okay, Will Smith, you can use Shrek.
I mean, if Will Smith calls you and asks for a favor, I feel like
You're like, all right.
okay, yeah.
Sure, Will Smith, whatever you say.
We talked about the movie adding religion to the story, which I did not enjoy.
Yeah, I was not a big
It
fan
was
of that.
a very weak element.
Yeah,
of the story overall in the movie.
It didn't. Yeah, I just thought it was. It wasn't really fleshed out in a way.
It doesn't add anything. I thought it felt like shoehorned in at the end.
Yeah, it does because it does. It's not a recurring theme really until Anna shows up, and then it becomes this big element of the film, and then it just doesn't feel like it really goes anywhere. Again, with the alt. Yeah, I agree. It does feel kind of shoehorned in. All right, Katie, it's time to find out what you thought was better in the movie.
My life has taught me one lesson, Hugo, and not the one I thought it would. Happy endings only happen in the movies.
So one of my least favorite things about this book, there's a weird amount of focus about Robert Neville being horny and worrying that one day he'll have sex with one of the female vampires. Like a weird preoccupation with it. We keep coming back to it. And I'm really glad that the movie did not subject us to that.
Yeah.
I much preferred just having that emphasis on him being starved for any human interaction.
Yeah, that feels way more realistic anyway. Like, at this point, I'm not worried about having sex. I'm worried about seeing a person.
If sex is something that you're into, I feel like that would maybe bother you at first.
Yeah.
But, like, as we continued through the years, any human interaction.
Yeah, literally
anything. Literally anything.
Anything. And yeah, for sure. Because the and that's the other thing too. With sex, at least part of it you can you can take care of.
You can get there.
You can take care of by yourself, at least some of the aspect of it. But the aspect that you can't take care of, which is the part that they focused on, is the human connection.
Yes.
Like, that's the part of it that you can't take care of it. So yeah, it totally I agree for sure.
It was a really weird, like, very uncomfortable element. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the point was that it was uncomfortable. But definitely would be interested to hear from anyone else who read this, how they felt about that element of the story, because I did not enjoy it. A couple other small notes. We've kind of already talked about these. I thought the role of the dog in the movie had a much more emotional weight in the story overall than it did in the book. And I also thought that some action sequences were a welcome addition to this story, especially in film form.
Yep. All right. We do not have a movie nailed it section. Do you want to discuss it all why before we
I had a
move
couple
on?
things in the movie nailed it. And then you asked questions about those things, so that section just ended up getting eliminated.
And the movie was, from my understanding, just to expand on, and you may go into this a little bit more in your final verdict, the movie is very different
Yes,
than
it
the
is.
book. So
it's one of those times where it takes the premise and runs
a few
with it.
elements of it, but a lot of it is pretty different. So we already talked about a lot of the parts that were in the book and the movie. We got a handful of odds and ends before we get to the final verdict. You mentioned the Wicked poster in Times Square. I just noticed it, and I went and as I was I was like, wait a second. There's a giant Batman and Superman poster. It's the Batman logo with the Superman logo on top of it.
Yeah.
And I was like, is that literally the Batman vs. Superman poster? And I went and looked. It's not exactly it, but it's pretty close. And this is a decade before that movie came out.
It's a what do you call a pre-Easter egg?
Well, and this is Warner Brothers, which at the time at least, and maybe still, I think they still own DC. I don't know how the DC movies work because I don't care. I don't like most of them. So most of them not particularly interested in. There's a few, but so I don't know exactly like who owns, because like for a while, like Disney, Marvel was its own studio, but now Disney, they're under Disney, and I don't know the whole situation with DC. But I do know Warner Brothers because like that's why when you go to Six Flags,
yeah,
it's all Warner Brothers stuff and DC stuff. So they obviously had the rights to the license or whatever. And I'm sure even in 2006 or whatever, when this movie was being filmed, they were discussing things down the road. But it is kind of wild to me how close I think it is to like the actual Batman vs. Superman like logos that we got eventually. Super fascinating. If you Google it, because I was looking at articles and stuff about this movie afterwards, and several articles mentioned that poster. So if you go do some searching, you'll find it very easily and see people talking about it. But I thought it was, a decade before, more than a decade before that movie ever anything. Before even the first, Man of Steel was like 2013. Like Man of Steel was a half a decade after this movie. This movie was before. This was like post.
I mean,
Superman
this
Returns
is even
or whatever.
Pre like Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Iron Man was
2008.
2008. So like the year. So this is before all of the big comic book movie boom. Like this is in between Spider-Man and the other big boom. But it's wild that it was so. I was like, what the heck? I literally had to go look. Like, wait, when? I was like, I had a moment where I was like, when did Batman vs. Superman come out? No, it was like a couple years ago. I was so confused for a second. That was super wild.
Okay, so this is something that bothered me in the movie, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm more than willing to be corrected. But he keeps saying that he's trying to develop a vaccine, when it seems like what he's doing is trying to develop a cure. Aren't
treatment.
Vaccines preventative?
Yes, you can't give a vaccine to somebody already infected.
Okay, that's what I thought.
At least from my understanding.
I was like, if I have not learned anything over these past 2 years, I feel like I understand what a vaccine is at this point.
Yeah, from my understanding, vaccine, because that's the thing. The terrible stories of people who didn't get the vaccine for whatever reason end up getting COVID, and while they're in the hospital are like, can I get the vaccine now? And it's like, nope,
nobody.
It doesn't do anything anymore. You can get, if you get better, you can get but giving you the vaccine while you're sick right now is not gonna help. I again, maybe there are niche circumstances where something called a vaccine, I don't know enough about virology or whatever to know. There may be some circumstances where a vaccine can be used as a treatment. I don't know. But in general, from my understanding, yes, you would not call that a vaccine. You would call that a treatment or whatever, a cure, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Again, any medically knowledgeable people out there want to chime in. And I mean actually medically knowledgeable people, not Facebook medically knowledgeable people. Don't care what you think about vaccines. Also, don't listen to our show. What was my next note? Oh, the creatures in this movie should not have been CGI.
I agree.
Oh my God.
They look ridiculous.
It's such a mistake.
We couldn't have had the weird growing mouths, Which,
again, was why. Who cares? It's dumb. They should have been. And even if you want to use, like, when they're, like, swarming, when you got a bunch of them and they're, you want to use it or certain shots. But, like, in the basement, when they're just standing around, those should be makeup.
Especially when they're close up.
Yes, those should be 100% those should just be makeup effects, practical effects. It's such a mistake. But it's right in that period where we were starting to use CGI for everything and hadn't realized its limitations yet. Yeah. And so we were
just excited about the new tech.
Yeah.
Just excited about it.
Yeah.
You know.
But it also is funny. It these did remind me a little bit of, so the director of this, Francis Collins, reminded me a little bit of the mutations from one of the last.
Where they're when they're in the sewers.
In Hunger Games Catching Fire 2 or 1 or whichever it is. Or not Catching Fire, Mockingjay 1 or 2.
Mockingjay 2, I think.
2, yeah.
I think.
Anyways, kind of like those creatures in the sewer. Like
kind of reminiscent. Yeah. Speaking of the scene in the basement, something about a scientist screaming, "Stop, let me save you," while ill people shriek and try to kill him was like, oof.
Little, yeah. I mean, that does kind of run contrary to the actual point of the story. Like, the point being that he's in the wrong.
Yeah.
So, but like in isolation, if you don't look at the rest of the movie and this point of the story of him being the monster and that sort of thing, if you're just looking at like, because in the movie he is actually a scientist who does find a cure and is, in that context, it is that moment of him just like, let me help you, and they're like, fucking kill you. It's like, okay, great.
And from here in 2022, that is.
Yeah. My last note, and I kind of talked about it, but this movie is just so depressing.
Yeah.
I do think, given some changes, because I wrote at the end of this movie, I was like, what is even, after he blows himself up and everything, and it's just like, what is even the point of this movie? I just feel like shit. Like, I don't.
Yeah. I turned to you partway through this movie, and I was like, this is upsetting.
Yeah.
This is like one of the most upsetting things I've ever watched. And I don't think I've ever done that before.
No. I will say that handled slightly different with the original ending, not the theatrical ending, and handled slightly differently in terms of his character setup and to get to the twist, the sort of Twilight Zone twist of him being the monster would have been more interesting. I still don't know if I would like it necessarily because it's just so miserable for so long. Yeah. Like, so much of the movie is just so depressing. Like, it's just, oh God, it's just miserable to watch, especially in a post-COVID or during COVID world.
I think the thing that makes it feel different from like Outbreak or Contagion, these other ones that we watched, is that it feels like making you miserable is the point.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and it's like, and just the lingering shots on the dog dying and injured. Yeah. It just gets to a point where you're just like, I get it. It sucks. Like, and again, I think it's maybe, watching this movie in 2010 feels different than it did watching it in 20. I don't know.
I'll never know.
We'll never know. But, like I said, I think ending handled differently, slight other changes. I think this movie could work pretty well. I still don't know if I'd ever want to watch it.
I never want to watch this again.
No, I agree. I'm just saying I think with some proper changes, I could have enjoyed it more as a film.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever want to watch it again, but I at least have enjoyed it more as a film. As it is in the theatrical cut, I had like zero connection or like interest. I just hated watching it most of the time, even though I thought a lot of the filmmaking was pretty well done and effective, and the performance, like Will Smith's performance, is very good, and like all that stuff.
He's great.
Yeah, everything. Like, it's a very effectively made film. I just don't care for the effect. It's just
and I think that is an important distinction, and I am glad that we talk about that on this show. Is that something can be a well-made piece of art, and you can still not like it.
Yeah.
That's okay.
It's true. It's true. It's true. Well, also, it's not a well-made piece of art because the ending sucks.
Fair.
But with a good ending. Anyways, before we get to the final verdict, we wanted to remind you can do us a giant favor by heading over to patreon.com/thisfilmislit. Support us there for a couple bucks a month, $2, $5, $15 a month. Get access to different stuff at every level. Bonus content starts at $5. Actually, bonus content kind of starts at $2 now, but the main audio bonus episodes start at $5. But at $2, you get access to our reading notes, as well as early access and some other stuff. $5, you get access to all that stuff. Plus bonus episodes where we talk about whatever we want to talk about in episodes. We talked about The Witcher. We've talked about our next episode coming out is Lilo and Stitch. Just random stuff not related to books necessarily, and adaptations and that sort of thing. And then at $15 levels, you get all that stuff. Plus, you get priority recommendation, which you can use to ask us to talk about something that you would like to hear us talk about, which is what this episode was. This was a patron request from somebody who changed their name, I think, post-prequel episode. Post-prequel. Request from Genre Fluid Short Novelette. So if you listen to our prequel episode, we discussed the difference between a novel and a novella, and there was lots of discussion in there. And also we discussed genre fiction versus non-genre fiction. Got a little heated. And so we have Genre Fluid Short Novelette capitalizing on that. Thank you, Genre Fluid Short Novelette. I don't know who you actually are. Do you know who this actually is in the patrons normally? Like what their name normally is?
This is a patron who changes their name.
Oh, there you go.
A name change patron.
A name change patron. There you go. All right, Katie, it's time for the final verdict.
Now, are you ready for your sentence?
Sentence? But there must be a verdict first.
Sentence first, verdict afterward.
I'll just be upfront here. I did not really care for either of these.
That's fair.
I found the movie deeply upsetting. Just like the most upset-inducing thing I've watched in a while. I thought the book had some interesting ideas, but overall, it just didn't really do anything for me. I will say that I would like to see a more straight adaptation of this book. I think with the right director and creative vision, it could be really interesting. And I also think it could be easily updated to reflect current times.
Real quick, we discussed in the prequel that at one point Guillermo del Toro was attached to this movie.
I think that could be bomb.
This would have been incredible because there's no way that ending would have flew. Like Guillermo del Toro would have just quit if they would have tried to change that ending.
Guillermo del Toro also probably would have embraced the vampire aspect of it.
Yes, he would have embraced that. He would have his movies are all about sympathy and empathy and all that sort of stuff. And he also probably would have leaned into the climate change potential. There's so much of the stuff that we thought could have been cool. I think he would have done.
There's a lot of untapped potential in this story, I think. And now I haven't seen any of the other adaptations. Maybe they're a little bit closer. I don't know.
Yeah.
But comparing these two one-to-one, it felt like there was a lot of potential in the story that was abandoned. Part of what this comes down to for me is that this movie felt like a pretty generic last man alive post-apocalyptic story. But the book I thought had some interesting ideas, namely that the creatures are vampire-like, and part of how the main character spends his time is trying to figure out if there's a scientific explanation for why these old vampire legends appear to hold water. Another major thing that this verdict comes down to is the ending and overall theme. This story is essentially an exploration of what it means to be the other, which is a pretty common post-war, post-modern theme to explore because a lot of what was considered quote-unquote normal got upended during and following World War II, which is why the 1950s in America are characterized by such an aggressive return to traditional values. But the fact that Neville unthinkingly assumes himself to be normal, only to find out that he is actually the other, and be forced to grapple with that, is interesting. And with the right creative vision, I think that could be extremely relevant for current audiences. Mm-hmm. But the thing that really pushes me over the edge on this one is the fact that the movie went with the theatrical ending. The entire point of the book's ending is that, yes, Robert Neville is a legend, but in a bad way. He went right on ahead doing what he thought was right for him to do without any consideration of the consequences or the effect that his actions could have. The movie's theatrical ending basically scratches that, reverses it, and now he's a legend because he's so smart and brave.
It's so wild. It's so wild. It's such a wild decision.
If the movie had gone with the alternate ending, I would still pick the book. But it is primarily because of the movie's abandoning of what I felt were the only interesting elements from the story that I'm giving this one to the book.
Katie, what's next?
Up next, we will be talking about the novel Fingersmith by Sarah Waters and its 2016 film adaptation, The Handmaiden.
The Handmaiden.
Which I believe is a Korean
I think it is
film.
Korean film,
Yeah.
from my memory. I've heard very good things about this movie. I haven't seen it, but I am interested. I'm looking forward to seeing it because I've heard, like I said, I've heard good things. So it should be fun.
I've heard good things about the movie.
I didn't know it was based on a book. I'd heard of the movie without knowing it was based on a book.
And actually, there is like a 2-part TV series adaptation of this book, which this is another patron request, and they did specifically ask us to do the 2016 film. But that could be interesting to talk about some other time down the road.
Interesting. Cool. So yeah, we'll be doing The Handmaiden / Fingersmith. So go ahead and look out for those. We'll be doing a little preview of that on our prequel episode in 1 week's time. And in 2 weeks' time, we're talking about The Handmaiden. Until that time, guys, gals, non-binary pals, everybody else,
Keep reading books.
keep watching movies.
And keep being awesome.